In a moment when inclusive culture work is under open attack, Howard Ross offers a longer view grounded in history, cognitive science, and a half century of practice. If you are rebuilding people experience strategy, navigating belonging in remote teams, or sorting out belonging versus inclusion for your organization, this episode will give you the language and direction. Hello, friends, and welcome to I Know I Belong When, an innovation, unbiased production where bold voices, curious stories, and authentic impact amplify knowing that you are invited, seen, heard, and needed. Our conversations go from the boardrooms to the break rooms, from the sidewalks to our living rooms, from our relationships to ourselves. We explore the full spectrum of belonging, the joy of being seen, the pain of being left out, and the courage it takes to build spaces where every identity is welcomed, valued, and loved. We also hold space for each of our unique identities to joyfully prosper and thrive. I am your host, Christopher Bailone, someone who believes knowing you belong is a birthright. Friends, I am pinching myself because today's guest is someone whose work shaped how I viewed myself as a practitioner of belonging. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine someone who marched for civil rights before most people even had the vocabulary for it, who spent decades translating the gap between what we mean to do and the harm we sometimes always do, who sat across from thousands of leaders, organizations, communities, and said with full love and full accountability, we can do better than this. Now imagine that same person goes home, picks up a guitar, and rocks out because, yes, he is currently playing in not one, however, two bands. And then before the next gig, he sits down to meditate because he has been a meditation teacher for over 25 years. This is not a character in a novel. This is Howard J. Ross. Howard is a writer, speaker, facilitator, and I would argue one of the most important voices in the belonging and unconscious bias space alive today. He has been asking a question his entire life that most of us are now just beginning to sit with. What does it mean to live with integrity in a world that consistently invites us to look away? He is a husband of more than 30 years, a father of 4 sons, a man who understands that legacy is not what you put on your resume. It is what you model at the dinner table, on stage, and in the silence between the notes. And speaking of what gets passed down, Howard is currently writing the 2nd edition of Everyday Bias with one of those sons. That's right, father and son co-authoring one of the most anticipated updates in the belonging and bias space. And because this show does not do anything small, his son will be joining us as a guest as well, dropping in back-to-back weeks. 2 episodes, 1 lineage, 0 filler. Howard does not rush to fix complexity. He sits with it, and he invites you to do the same. In a culture addicted to outrage and certainty, that kind of quiet courage is rare. Howard, welcome to I Know I Belong When.
Christopher, thank you so much for that lovely and gracious introduction. My father would have loved it. My mother would have even believed some of it. So I appreciate it.
Well, you're welcome. I mean, it's true. I have been watching you from afar. I know that may sound a little creepy.
Oh, you're the guy behind the tree out there.
Yeah. That's me. That's me with binoculars. But no, seriously, as somebody who was a young and up and coming practitioner in this space, your work has really shaped how I viewed myself as a practitioner, but also how I actually practice my craft. And so I appreciate what you have done and having a little bit of a fangirl moment that you're on my show.
Well, I do, all kidding aside, I really appreciate that. It's funny, you talked about legacy in the introduction, and, I just turned 75 in January, as I think you know. And so those questions are much more in my mind than they've ever been before. Did it matter that I was here? So it's very kind and generous of you, but it also means a lot to me.
Thank you. I'm having the same conversations with my mom. She's a couple years behind you. Mm-hmm. And we keep always talking about what our legacy is. There's a great book, Your Leadership Legacy, that talks about if you're worried about what your legacy is going to be when you're writing your retirement speech, it's too late. you need to be thinking about what your legacy is from day one.
Yeah,
So this
so
is a
true
great
that.
little,
True,
great
true
little
that.
reminder that
Yes.
don't wait,
Hmm.
start now. So, okay, let's get into the conversation.
Please.
Howard, you have spent decades helping organizations and individuals name what most people would rather avoid. When you look back at the through line of your career from those early days to now, what surprises you most about how far the conversation has come and how far we still have to go?
I guess, as somebody who's a historian by training, because that's where my original background was, Christopher, I can't say that I'm surprised. I mean, I think that maybe a little bit surprised by how quickly things swing back and forth these days, because I don't think anybody growing up in the era that I grew up in could anticipate the speed of change and how quickly things happen now. But I think this notion of the movement towards social justice, the movement towards human rights, being a movement that has never been a direct line. It's always been 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. I mean, if we take a look at our own country, for example, where racial healing is concerned, just starting with the Emancipation Proclamation, we know we had that, and then immediately Reconstruction ends and the Klan comes in. And then we have the Black Codes of the South. And then we have, movement during World War I. All the soldiers are getting there. More money's coming back into the Black community. And you see things like Tulsa and other communities grow. And then you've got the Red Summers of 1919, 20, and 21 come in when, whites go in and destroy those communities. I mean, I could continue to go, but we know this has been the path of history. And so the fact that we've swung back right now is disappointing, certainly, and the level and degree of it is upsetting. And a lot of that is fed by things that we'll be talking about by media and technology and some of the ways that we can spread messaging in ways that we couldn't before. But I've always known and always will know that this is going to be a long haul, and it's always going to be 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. And unfortunately, we're in one of those regressive times right now.
Yeah, it's, I think, what makes us a human society is
Yes.
that we're fallible. Sometimes we fail big and sometimes we fail small. And it feels right now as a human society, we're failing rather big right now. However, I have hope.
Well, I think that
Uh,
there's another piece to it that's important to understand, and that is when we understand the human brain, we can see why this happens. That take on anything in your life that you've tried to change. Anybody who's listening to us, and we know thousands and thousands have tried dieting, for example. How many people have
yes.
dieted without slipping back? How many people stop drinking without regressing and falling off the wagon? How many people, exercise? How many of us know we should exercise, and yet we have those periods of months even when we just stop? So this is no different in that regard, in that we're dealing with these two parts of the human brain. The one part, which is the conscious level, which knows what we need and should do. And then the other part, which is our instinctive or impulsive level, which wants to do what it wants to do when it wants to do it. So the tension is a human tension. It's just being played out on a social and a systemic level.
Yeah, absolutely. Case in point, when it comes to dieting, I have been yo-yoing my weight almost my entire adult life. And so I get it, right? So prime example on very much a microcosm.
Yep.
So through your writing, Everyday Bias, Our Search for Belonging, Reinventing Diversity, and now with your second edition of Everyday Bias, you have been writing and rewriting the vocabulary of this work for years. What does it mean to you that you are doing this work not just as a practitioner, but as a father passing this down through your son?
Well, I mean, that's always been incredibly important to me. And I'm really blessed because I've got 4 sons, all of whom have extraordinary values. They have different opinions about things, but they all have extraordinary values, and they all are willing to put other people ahead of themselves and think in terms of the large picture. So it's an incredible blessing to know that that's true for my kids, particularly at a time now when families are being torn apart by some of these differences in beliefs. I think where Jake is concerned, with my youngest son, the one who I wrote this with, it's been a fascinating experience. Jake is very smart, very interested in this stuff himself. As you know, he graduated from Berkeley with a degree in focus on belonging, and then got his master's in positive psychology from University of Pennsylvania, which is all about belonging. And so when I invited him to write this edition with me, my thought was really, this will help him get a bump in his career. And I've said to any number of people, I started writing it with my son and ended up writing it with a colleague, because what I found was that he was really quite brilliant about his distinctions, not only of belonging, but also especially how technology, and he'll talk more about that with you next time, how technology, social media, AI, et cetera, is really bringing a whole nother dimension to these concepts that we have to pay attention to. So it's talk about legacy. I mean, it's really something when you see your sons as peers, when you begin to see them as peers, or even sometimes more.
Yes.
One of my sons is a heart surgeon, so it's like, we're at a whole nother level. So it's
Yeah,
incredibly,
absolutely.
incredibly rewarding to be able to do that.
Well, that's really special. And thank you for both for bringing this new edition out to the world at a time that it's very, very much needed.
Mm.
So, you are a rock and roll musician currently playing in two bands.
Mhm.
You are a meditation teacher of 25 years. And as I would say, one of the most foremost voices in unconscious
Mm.
bias. Most people pick a lane. You seem to live at the intersection. How does all of that inform who Howard Ross is as a person, not just as a professional?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think we are different. We know that, with various different typing systems. We know whether you go to Myers-Briggs or the Enneagram or whatever, there are all these different typing systems that tell us that, but we often don't live like we know that. So we know that there's certain types, and my wife tends to be this way, for example, who find something, get really focused and focused in on that thing, and they tend to want to work on that one thing. I've always been somebody from the time I was little, and I know now it's associated to the fact that I'm ADD or ADHD. But at the time that I grew up, of course, we didn't have the distinction, so they didn't even know how to,
Right.
how to diagnose it. I didn't find out until I found out my son had it, and I said I was like that. I was a kid. The doctor said, "Oh yeah, you had it too." But the blessing of that is that we have a tendency not to. People with this kind of mindset have a tendency not to stay focused in one place. If you put me here, my natural tendency is to say, well, what about that and that and that and that? And I just naturally have a broader view and bring in the connections. So when I started studying bias, for example, and started to look into some of the research, it was not at all peculiar for me, although it might seem so for some people, to find myself going into the neuroscience and the brain science behind this stuff. It wasn't at all surprising that I started to go into the cultural influences behind it, and all these various aspects, because that's just the way my mind's organized. Now, the downside of that sometimes can be it's hard for me to focus, and that's when I get into writing and research, for example. I've got to really discipline myself. And I've had to learn to do that over the years. Fortunately, I've been able to do that successfully. But I think that I feel really blessed because I think those connections, particularly when we look at conversations like belonging, these broader connections and the nuance behind some of these things is so essential to our getting a deeper understanding, especially in a world where people are looking for instant pudding. They're looking for the answer in 240 characters or a 18-minute TED talk. And life doesn't really live like that. Life lives in much more
Right.
nuanced and complex ways.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think we, even now, as we're living in this age of AI and really starting to understand, what's real and what's not, and who is writing their own original work and who isn't. And I know we'll have that more conversation with your son, Jake, next week. But I think it's also something very much at the forefront of how are we making sure that we're showing up as real humans.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to shift the conversation into the
Please.
segment that we call We Say Names.
Okay.
And so I want to make sure that we're honoring people's names. And so you have come of age during a time of real social upheaval. You chose to march and engage when others around you did not. Is there a name, a person, a teacher, ancestor, movement leader who you feel deserves to be spoken out loud as someone who lit that fire in you?
Wow. Well, I can just, if you excuse me moving my computer for a minute, you can see already the wall behind me. And I'll show you quickly the wall across from me,
Wow.
which is hundreds of other pictures, because I am somebody who believes that I am those who have influenced me. The heroes and sheroes in my life were incredibly important to me. And I think if I were to choose one to talk about right now, it would be relative to this picture right behind me, which I know looks like a gravestone, but it's actually a memorial plaque at a memorial grove in Israel to my grandfather, Samuel Bulmash. I mean, his fascinating story. He grew up in Ukraine in a small Jewish community in the Western Ukraine, left to be sent to a yeshiva to study, become a rabbi when he was 12. This was in the early 20th century, probably about 1907, 1908. The yeshiva was attacked by Cossacks and burned down. And at the age of 12, he managed to get to some place called Philadelphia in a country called America by himself and find relatives. The village he grew up in, Trochenbrod in western Ukraine, was eventually obliterated by the Nazis. All but 100 of the 6,000 Jews who lived there were killed in 2 days, August 2nd to 3rd, 1942. And he became a real freedom fighter. He was one of the people responsible for gathering together the team that purchased and outfitted the Exodus ship in Baltimore Harbor, the ship that went to save hundreds of Jewish children from the Nazis. He was one of the founders of the NAACP in Baltimore. So I think the lesson through him, among others in my family, was terrible things can happen and you have a responsibility to do something about it. And I think that's a legacy that I'm very proud of in our family. My older sister became one of our nation's leading immigration lawyers until she recently retired. My younger sister has worked with social justice organizations all around the world, including for 20 years being Marian Wright Edelman's fundraiser to Children's Defense Fund. I took the path that I took, but there's no question that our Zadie, our Grandpa Sam, is back there cheering us on as we do these things.
What an amazing legacy, and thank you for sharing that. And for those who are only listening in via audio and not looking at us on video, just the pictures that Howard just showed of the leaders of our civil rights movement, not just in the US, but around the world, was a little breathtaking for me, even as somebody who has worked in this space for a long time. So thank you for sharing that. What a lovely visualization of the work that has predated us and empowering us to go forward. So thank you for
I
that.
think this is so important, Christopher, because this is hard work. And as we said before, it's not work that's linear. You're going to be kicked back sometimes. And, I can look out here and I can see a picture of Stephen Biko, or I can see a picture of Thurgood Marshall, or some of my contemporaries, Janetta Cole, or Nelson Mandela, and all of these were people who had to deal with setbacks and said, "We're not stopping." And so I think that's important for us to recognize that when you're trying to create the kind of social change that we're working on, the kind of major change, it's never going to be a direct line, and you're going to have to deal with setbacks, and that's part of the process.
Yes, agreed. And I think while it is unfortunate that we do have setbacks, it's always an opportunity for us to learn. It's one of the things I appreciate of my son's coaches on their sports teams. It's you win or you learn. And so how are we learning in this moment to be able to advance the society in which we want to show up in? It's just we're learning.
And look, I mean, I think it's natural for human beings to start with feeling like you're a victim when you have a setback. And we're experiencing this right now in the DE&I space, right? Because there has been this external terrorist campaign against DE&I. Yes. There's no question that that's been going on. I know all about it because I was one of the first people targeted by it. It has very little to do with the truth. It has very little to do with what it's being used for, which is to really suppress the growth of especially Black and LGBTQ folks in our society, among others. However, that doesn't change the fact that we've also done some things that miss the mark in the movement. And yes. I think that if we get stuck in the, why are they being so mean to us kind of a mindset, these terrible people are being so mean to us, we lose the opportunity to say, okay, and what can we do differently to deal with this reaction? Now, that doesn't mean that we also ignore the fact that what's true is out there, that there is an attack, but there's got to be some balance. It has to be both criticism and self-criticism if we're going to really find new ways forward. And in that sense, I think some of this backlash has shown us that some of the approaches we took are not particularly viable because they're not oriented towards belonging.
Yeah, exactly. And so speaking about belonging, is there somebody who you say showed you something about belonging that you could not have learned from a book or a stage that really taught you what belonging meant?
Wow. The answer is yes. There are any number of people who I can think about. I go back to my early days. I was trained by Saul Alinsky. And on one hand, that experience taught me about what radical opposition could be and creative opposition could be about, but it also taught me about the importance of honoring the humanity of those on the other side. And the more we honored the humanity of those on the other side, they were more open to a new possibility. And I think this is a real challenge that we have right now. I mean, I think if we look Gandhi, Dr. King, all of these great leaders we think about, Baldwin, who sits here over my shoulder, Dr. Cole, who sits over my other shoulder, Maya Angelou, if you read any of these people's writings, what you hear is there is a way to disagree on issues and disagree on beliefs while at the same time honoring other people's humanity. And that's what I try to hold out. Baldwin famously said, we can agree to disagree and still love each other as long as your disagreement is not rooted in the denial of my humanity. And I think that
Yes,
that's a really beautiful way to hold it.
absolutely. Absolutely. I think that that's really impactful. I also, thinking about Maya Angelou and where she said famously, people will forget what you did, people will forget what you said, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And for me, it's a quote that sits on my desk that I look at every day, and it sits
Absolutely.
below a picture of a dean of mine from undergrad who was one of those who taught me what belonging was all about, even probably before we had the language of belonging.
Mm.
And her picture sits on there. She passed away from breast cancer when I was in grad school. And, I talked to Francine a lot.
Hmm.
And that was a quote that she lived by. And so thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
So I want to talk about your moment of belonging. You have written beautifully about belonging. You have talked about it from a vulnerability place and mutual recognition. Can you bring us inside a specific moment in your life where you truly felt that? Not on stage, not in a conference room, however, in a human moment that really stopped you in your tracks.
Yeah. Yeah, I can. I mean, there have been lots actually, but there's one in particular that comes to mind. When I was a junior in college, I had actually very similar story to yours, that I had a teacher who was deeply influential to me. Her name is Adrienne Koch. She was an intellectual historian, and I had taken a course with her at the end of my junior year and was just blown away. And being ADD, I never enjoyed school all that much. I was always one of these people who school got in the way of my learning. But she lit me up. And I just, for the first time, I had a professor who really I felt like I could, kind of get with. And I was supposed to take another course with her the following fall. And that summer she died from cancer. And I was just so disappointed by that and despondent that I just decided to take a semester off. And I was looking for something to do. So I got a job teaching at a daycare center because I loved working with kids. I had helped create a program working with inner city kids while I was at college. So it was natural for me to continue to do that. And there was a woman there. Her name was Nancy Neal. And she was the teacher. She's also on my wall. Actually, this is her right here. That's a picture of Nancy. She's passed many years ago now. And we were there. It was very early, and we were in a meeting. I mean, I was just an assistant teacher at the time, kind of bus driver and assistant teacher. And we were sitting there, and I was sort of wet behind. I had no idea what I was doing. We were sitting in a staff meeting, and at some point in one of the early staff meetings we had, Nancy turns to me and she says, "What do you think about this? We haven't heard anything from you." And I'm like, well, I'm just too new and too dumb to know to say anything, is what I'm thinking to myself. But she was interested in what I had to say. And she not
Mm-hmm.
only asked me that, but she sort of coaxed more out of me. And at that moment, I realized, wow, I do fit in here. I do have a role here. I do have a place here. It's okay for me to be myself, to say what's on my mind. And I think that invitation really opened me up to embracing being there in a way that I had never before. And it's something that I tried to remember all the time when I was running a company, when I had 50 people in my company. And that is that, when you're on a phone call and the younger person is there and the client's talking to you, to take a minute and say, "Hey, we haven't heard from you, Audrey. What do you think about this?" Or, "We haven't heard from
Yeah.
you, Jay." It was whatever it is. And just that moment of recognition and having somebody senior to you say, "I'm interested in what you have to say," is incredibly valuable.
Yes, because I think that's one of the things we probably miss is that how are we making sure that the voices that aren't currently included in the conversation get included? And that's a responsibility we have as a leader to identify whose voice isn't being heard, included in the direction that we're going, and making sure that voice is. So
Well
that's
said.
awesome.
Yeah, well said.
And taught you very young about how to bring others into the conversation that haven't been brought in before. So I want to shift to start talking about everyday bias. And so in writing this next edition with your son, was there a moment in that collaboration, the conversation, a disagreement, a breakthrough where you felt something shift between the two of you that had nothing to do with the book and everything to do with belonging?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was a very specific moment. Jake has his master's, I think I said earlier, from University of Pennsylvania positive psychology program, the home of positive psychology, Marty Seligman's work there. And He invited me to come with him to one of their annual meetings that they have, where the people gather. They have this sort of 1 day or 2 day summit where everybody gathers together for a weekend. And he invited me to come, and I got a chance to watch him like interacting with his colleagues, with his peers. And I was not playing a particular role. I was more of an observer because it wasn't really my scene. I was visiting in his scene. But nonetheless, I got a chance to see him interact, to see him sharing all the different things he said. And we had dinner that evening before I was going to drop him off to the airport to fly back to California, and I was going to drive home. And I sat with him across the table, and I actually took his hands in mine, and I looked him in the eyes, and I said, I want you to know that from this time moving forward, I'm not going to relate to you in this project as my son. I'm going to relate to you as my colleague, because I realize now that you've got all you need to have your own legitimate seat at the table in this conversation without being my kid. And it was really, I think, a really very sweet moment for both of us. And there are multiple parts of that. Like, part of it was listening to him in a different way. Part of it was not letting him off the hook like I might as a dad, because I'm sorry, I was supposed to get that to you, but I was busy, and as a dad, I might say, oh yeah, I know you're busy. As a colleague, I'd say, okay, when am I going to have it? It's like, so it's a different, it's a different way of being. And I think that
Yes.
For him, I think, and you'll have to talk to him about this, but I think that being respected in that way made a big difference to him as well. And the truth is, he has a deep understanding of this stuff, particularly in the AI space, because he's worked in the AI space, much deeper understanding than I do in terms of some of the peculiarities and particularities of it.
No, that's wonderful. And
Yeah.
and thank you. What a great gift to be able to recognize when someone evolves into that next level of professionalism, and being able to recognize that. And even more special that it was your own dad. So that's just great. So want to keep the conversation going about everyday bias. And so this update is tackling bias in social media and artificial intelligence, as we just talked about. That is not just an intellectual exercise. That's a recognition that the systems around us are now shaping us, who gets seen and who gets erased. So what did the research reveal to you about how non-belonging is being engineered at scale?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to recognize that all humans have bias. You and I both know that. This is the truth of us. And humans design
Yes.
these systems. So that by very definition, the systems are designed with bias. Not necessarily intentionally, although sometimes intentionally, but not necessarily intentionally, but the systems are designed with bias, and that bias is inherent in anything it does. And so we know that, for example, some of the terminology we use, some of the things that we see are important, the value we place on certain words, the relationship between certain concepts, all of this stuff is programmed into the system. And, we tend to see AI particularly now as sort of omniscient, because and what the research shows, there are really two major reasons for this. First of all, that the AI systems are designed to be so obsequious. Think, oh, that's a great question you asked, Christopher. This sort of a thing, which
Yeah.
pumps us up. And Jake did this thing when he was writing the chapter about AI obsequiousness. He put it into chat just to see what chat would say about it. And chat told him what a brilliant concept he thought it was. So it actually replicated what he was. He could tell you more about that, but it replicated exactly what he was doing. So I think that's one big piece of it, is that we're surrendering ourselves. And by the way, we know and we think that the reason that this is good is because it removes human emotion, because AI is like just the facts, but that's what we think. But in actuality, we know that the removal of human emotion doesn't make us better decision makers. And people who study the old stories about Phineas Gage, who, the guy in the 19th century who had that part of his brain disassembled, or Antonio Damasio, the great neuroscientist, talks about a patient named Elliot who had a similar thing happen, and they couldn't make decisions without emotion, because every decision we make is laden with emotion. So that's one component of it. Then another component of it, and this moves more to the social media side of it, is that we now have these easy to build tribes which reinforce agreement, with algorithms that reinforce agreement. So, and what we know about human beings, and I touched on this in my last book, Our Search for Belonging, is that if you take human beings with different points of view and put them into the same room and ask them to come up with a solution, they will generally move towards moderation. Not everybody, of course. Some people are argumentative, but mostly people will move towards moderation. If you take those same groups and put them in different rooms and ask them to solve the same exact problem, but now they're just with people who tend to agree with them, they'll move towards the extremes. And if you look at the way
Yes.
social media now is set up, social media completely reinforces this. The algorithms have us loaded down with people who agree with us and discourage people who don't agree with us. We friend or unfriend people based on whether they agree or disagree with us. And so our belief system gets magnified. We're just convinced not only do we have a point of view, but we're right. And not only right, but good as opposed to evil. And the other side is the other way. And this phenomenon, which they call the outgroup homogeneity effect, kicks in because we're not interacting with people. On the right, they assume everybody on the left is the same. On the left, they assume everybody on the right is the same. And so everybody's driven to the ends and they're all seen as being there. And because we have no central source of truth anymore, it used to be that we could go to certain places and we believed that what we're seeing was true, for years and years and years. If you saw something I grew up in the 60s. So, when Watergate came out, when the Pentagon Papers came out, Republicans may not have liked that the Washington Post and the New York Times reported it, but they didn't really question that it happened. They just didn't like the fact that it was being reported. And the same thing, by the way, is true on the left for things that we didn't like. That's very different to what's happening now, which is that people literally discard anything that they don't like as fake news and just go to what's being reproduced by whatever bot is on their side to say it. And even though I have a point of view, which is more legitimate, which is not, we have to acknowledge there's plenty of that happening on both sides.
Absolutely. I mean, we've been experiencing this for a number of years now where, it's what facts are we working with, right? And how are we making
What's
sure
a
we're
fact?
working from the same facts? Right. What's a fact? That's a totally another podcast, not this one. So I do want to narrow in on a little specific area. And I want to talk about the moment you said, I don't belong here. What did you do about it? And what was happening around you? And how did you navigate that path forward?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that the pathway to life is a pathway of belonging and unbelonging all the time. So I don't know that there's a particular moment. There's certainly lots of moments. I would say, just given the context that you and I meet here, I would say when I look at my history in the DE&I space, there have been lots of times when I felt in and out, even as much as my work has been acknowledged, and I'm deeply appreciative of that, even as much as I've got some of the deep relationships with colleagues, like I mentioned, Dr. Cole or other people who have been so important to me. There are times when I know that I was still a white guy, and therefore not really included. Post George Floyd, there was a lot of that. White people shouldn't be doing this work, especially white men shouldn't be doing this work, and feeling the need or the push to justify. And in my early days, I used to kind of roll out my civil rights credentials. I was like, yeah, but I did this and I did this and I knew this person. And then I realized it was like, there was a moment more than anything else where it happened. I can remember it like it was yesterday. It was probably 1988-ish, give or take. I was in Jackson, Mississippi. I'd asked to come down to do some work for the Clarion Ledger, which was their newspaper, the Jackson newspaper. So I was doing this workshop. There were probably 50, 75, 100 people in the room, something like that. And I'm starting to, I hadn't even said hello yet, and this guy, a young black guy in the front row raises his hand. I was maybe 8-10 minutes into my talk. And I called on him and he said, why do we have a white man doing this? And I felt it. I felt the part of me that was like, oh God, why am I here? Do I really have a place here? And the part of me that would have normally justified it and said, well, because I did this and I did that and I did that. In other words, I'm not your normal white guy is what I would be trying to say. And instead, I don't know why, sometimes these things happen by grace. Sometimes for some reason, you're just in a moment. And I looked at him and I said, because they hired me. And then everybody burst out laughing, as did he. And then I walked over to her and looked at him and said, all kidding aside, thank you for asking that question, because you're not the only one who was thinking it. But at the heart of it, isn't that why we're here? To see whether this matters, using my body as a reference, or these matter, my heart and my head. And I said, that's really what we're here to talk about, isn't it? And he said, good answer, and sat right down. And I think that was a moment where all of a sudden something changed for me. I realized that trying to justify, trying to prove myself was not the answer, that just being, like that famous quote, it's been attributed to everybody, Gandhi and everybody else, be the change you want to see in the world, that by actually being there like I had a right to be there was my ticket to being there.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that question was asked of you back in the 80s, because that very question was asked of me in 2022, 2023. I was in a job search. And, I'm a white guy. Yeah, I happen to be gay and happen to have a disability, but white and male precede me. And I can't tell you the number of times I had a chief people officer or a CEO as I was interviewing for chief diversity officer roles say, Christopher, you're a white guy. Why do you think you can do this work? And I knew I did not like performative DEI work before that. However, in that search and in those number of times that I got asked that question, for me, it resolved me that I was like, okay, I am here to do the policy, practice, and process evolution that organizations need to do, right? And let me demonstrate to you why I do this work, not give you my resume. And I think that is something that's really important for us and those of us who are white guys in this space, is that it's not about the credentials we have. It's about how are we showing up and demonstrating not just us as allies or our allyship, but how are we actually advocating and doing the real work that needs to happen?
Yeah, I think that, people, I think, pointed us in the right direction when they said we shouldn't be centering on only the white male experience. And there's no question that that's completely accurate. I believe that's completely accurate. But it's just as unhealthy to center only on the marginalized people experience. We've got to center on the experience, everybody's experience, that moves us to a culture of belonging where there's a role for everybody at the table. If we demonize some people as part of the process, we're just shifting the balance. Now, some people would say from a reparative standpoint that there are things that need to be repaired, whether that's financial reparations or other kind of reparations. And I think it's a viable conversation. It's one that we should be willing to engage in and do in a way that can work for our society and everybody else. But the notion that we're going to get to a society where everybody has a place, where everybody experiences a sense of belonging without having everybody engaged in that process is, to me, just silly. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, no, agreed. So talking about sustaining belonging now. So you have described love not as a feeling, however, as a daily practice, shaped by gratitude, endurance, and shared growth. How does that same framework apply to the work of sustaining belonging inside organizations and communities?
Well, I think that there's something, when we talk about love in a broader sense, we're really talking about honoring the humanity of other human beings. I mean, obviously love has many, many different forms. There's the love of a friend or the love of a lover or the love of whatever, your children, your parents, all these different things. But when we're talking about the more generic sense, we really mean that, in India, they greet each other with a namaste bow. People have seen this before. And what namaste has been translated many ways, but one of the translation is the soul in me sees the soul in you. And I think that that's really what the broader sense is, when we can see the humanity in each other, when who we are as human beings is not obscured by our attitudes, opinions, beliefs, skin color, gender, all these other things. We can see the core humanity in each other. And when we can do that, the difference becomes additive. So if you, for example, as a gay man and me as a hetero man, we can see the humanity in each other, then all of a sudden, how my life occurs differently from yours is fascinating. It's not threatening.
Yes.
If I don't see you, if I see that as the core of who you are, you're fundamentally different from me because you're gay, and I'm fundamentally different from you because I'm hetero, then it's hard for me to see that as anything other than a threat to me or something I'm uncomfortable with. And I think this is the mistake that a lot of people in the DE&I space have made when they hammered on people who look like me and say, you're an old straight white guy, you'll never understand. And so I'm sitting over here as somebody representing my group, and I'd say, all right, well then get away from me. Why should I be here? It's like I'm damned if I do or damned if I don't. All the people who were told, for example, after George Floyd was murdered, that they may think they're allies, but they're not good allies. And they said, I've been trying to do everything I can do, but if that's not good enough, let me go watch the ball game. It's like there's no cheese down this tunnel for me, And so we've got to give people a place to come to. And I think right now in the political discourse we're in, it's very important. There are people, for me as somebody who's more on the Democratic side, on the left side of this, not surprisingly, we've got to create some space for Republicans who are starting to say, maybe this isn't right, or independents who say this is right. But if our attitude is, well, you voted for him once, therefore you're damned to hell, then where are they going to go? Everybody needs a tribe. We've got to create that bigger tent if we expect to see it. And it came up last weekend during the No Kings March. There's some people say, this should be an anti-war march, or this should be a civil rights march. No, that's not what this particular march was about. This particular march was about this. But, all of this internecine stuff within our own side can be really problematic in that regard.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the things is always giving somebody grace and making sure that even when people make mistakes, and sometimes they make them over and over and over again, give them the grace to come to this realization that they've made a mistake. Now, some mistakes are irrecoverable, right? However, if we can allow somebody to recover from their mistakes, why aren't we helping them? As somebody who is of the Christian faith, I always think about what I learned as a Catholic, and that you always need to forgive. You don't necessarily always need to forget, but you always need to forgive and hold people accountable for what they need to do after they're forgiven. Because I think people forget, especially somebody from in the Catholic faith. And what I tell my fellow Catholics is that when you go to confession, it doesn't stop at the confessional, right? You are asked to do something to repair the mistakes you made, to repair your sins, right? You don't just get to go and, oh, Father, I have sinned, and you wash your hands of it. No, the priest is going to come back to you and say, okay, to be forgiven for your sins, this is the atonement you have to make. Mm-hmm. We stop at we ask for forgiveness of our sins. No. There's the other part of that where there's an atonement. And so we have a responsibility to do the repair work that's required of us when we make those mistakes. So I think it's something that we need to make sure that we're calling out in the space.
Yeah, and the work that we do on ourselves is a critical piece of that, because to the degree that we're willing to look for ourselves, it's like another biblical incantation, he is without sin, cast the first stone.
Yes.
When we really begin to realize, I really believe in trying to find a way to see the humanity in every human being. And there's sometimes when I lose my stuff. There's sometimes when I'm in an interaction with somebody online who's particularly offensive, and I just say, that's an idiotic thing to say, or what are you, a moron? Now, more times than not, I will afterwards go back and apologize for being rude. But there are also sometimes when I just use it as a way to let off steam, so that when I'm with people who are more reasonable, I can kind of maintain my sense of equilibrium. But, he is without sin, cast the first stone. I think we all know that we've got our bugaboos, we've got our blind spots, we've got our people who drive us crazy as a group. And anytime a group of people drives you crazy, you're missing the point, because there's no group of people who are all the same. But that's what can happen in this mindset.
Absolutely. Okay, so I only have a couple more questions for you. We have just been talking about your life's work, and you were just theorizing about kind of that second half of life. However, you're not just theorizing it, you're living it.
Yes.
You are leading retreats, circles of men navigating identity and reinvention. What does it look like to sustain belonging when the version of yourself you built your whole identity starts to shift?
Well, I'm really fortunate because, as I said before, having the kind of orientation I had to be interested in lots of things, I just kind of moved to other things. I made a choice. In fact, when I decided to sell my company back a few years ago, I said to Dr. Cole, I said, I'm thinking of stepping back some. And I said to her, sis, I just wonder if this is an act of privilege, And she said to me, bro, she said, you've done more than any three people. You can stop anytime you want. But I do think that I made a conscious choice to step off center stage. And I did it for a couple of reasons. First of all, because I knew that there were a lot of other things in my life that I wanted to spend time with, including having more time with my family, having more time to be politically active without it impacting my company. And, if I take a big political external posture that could impact the lives and livelihoods of people, even before all this nonsense, anti-DEI stuff started. And so I did consciously step away. And I think one of the things I realized in working with, because as you said, my wife Leslie and I both are working with men and women who are 50 and over, kind of going into how do we rewire our lives for this time. I think we live in a society in which we sort of get the notion that it's sort of downhill from here, particularly when you get to my age, when you get to 75. And yet I like to see it a different way. Another of my mentors, Manny Parker Palmer, who you may be familiar with, a beautiful writer, comes out of the Jesuit tradition. And who's a student of Thomas Merton's. And Parker, when he turned 80, he's I think 87 now, he wrote a beautiful book called On the Brink of Everything. And I think that that's my experience now. That was one phase of my life, but there's this whole new phase of my life, really embracing the elder role. I coach and mentor, oh gosh, I don't even know how many younger practitioners who are struggling to, turn towards some of the things that were important to me, but I haven't had time for because of my career, like music. You mentioned I played in bands for years, but I had to stop 20 years ago because I just couldn't do that and travel all over the world doing my consulting at the same time, So now I'm back to that, having more time with Leslie when she and I both were doing this consulting because we were partners in our business. And so we had a lot of times when I would go and then I'd come back and she had gone and then she would come back and, we didn't have as much time with each other as we like. And now we get to spend lots of time with each other, which is just delightful, fortunately for us. We're not one of those couples where people end up saying, I married him for better or for worse, but not for lunch, so yeah.
That's awesome.
So I think what it really comes down to, though, all kidding aside, Christopher, is being able to be present in the moment. Learning to be present at the moment and look what's wanted and needed now, as opposed to what I identified with from the past. And so much of that is ego identification. If I'm not standing up stage, if I'm not a DE&I expert, who am I? And the truth is, who I am is Howard. And that Howard, like Walt Whitman said, contains multitudes. So there's a lot of life still there and a lot of great things to do. And some of it is in that space and some of it's not.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. So I have a fun question for you.
Okay, great.
So as somebody who is a lover of music, I have to ask, when you're on stage or you're in the recording room with your bands, what does the set list look like? What energy is in the room when you're on stage? And has anyone in the audience ever recognized you as the unconscious bias guy during a mid-guitar solo?
Oh, yes, that's happened many times. I've had clients come up to me and say, what the hell are you doing here? It's like, I remember a number of years ago, particularly one gig where that happened. And I'm just playing on stage and they're standing right in front of the bandstand is one of my clients who I just had never mentioned the fact that I played in a band too, nor would I know. And he turned out he was a friend or a relative of the person who was throwing the particular party or something. But it was definitely one of those moments. But in terms of who I am being, look, as close as I get to Bruce Springsteen on any day, I'm happy. I love all kinds of music, but Bruce is kind of like my guitar god. So,
okay, that is very, very fair. And as a Jersey boy, I appreciate that.
Yeah, there you go.
So, Howard, we close the episode the same way with every guest, with a statement that gives the show its name. You have spent a lifetime helping others answer this very question. Now it is your turn. Howard, complete the sentence. I know I belong when
I can be fully myself. I know I belong when I can show up without having to worry that being me is going to exclude me, being me is going to make my voice not matter. When that's not present and I can just be there, I know I belong.
Howard, thank you so much for this conversation. It was really an honor to be able to have somebody I have looked up to for many years to be able to record and have this live in perpetuity. So I truly do appreciate and honor this.
Oh, Christopher, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
This has been a great reminder that belonging is not a destination. It is a practice, and it starts with listening. Friends, if this episode challenged you to move outside your comfort zone, please follow our show and give us that 5-star review you want to give, and add a comment about what you will do to champion a culture of belonging. These actions will help to amplify the message to others so they too can find their own moment of belonging. Whether it is navigating the complexities of workplace culture, finding acceptance in a new school, building trust in a local community, or forging identities within our own families, these stories reflect the raw, honest, and unfiltered journeys each of us take every day. And we want to hear from you. Finish the sentence, I know I belong when, and send us a voice note. Your story could open a future episode. Thank you for listening. Know that your bold, authentic self is welcomed, valued, and loved. And until next time, remember, you belong here.